June 1944. The sky above Normandy, France. Altitude, 500 feet. The air was thick with the reek of cordite and pulverized stone. It was a violence of an industrial scale, a calculated brutality necessary to fracture the concrete spine of Fortress Europe. While the grand historical narrative often focuses on the high drama of the beach landings, the true, agonizing work of the invasion, the relentless grind of moving men and machines inland, was happening in the bocage. This was a campaign of mud, hedgerows, and the sudden, savage close-quarters ambush. It was here, in this labyrinth of ancient fields, that the mechanized power of the Allies was tested against the deeply rooted defensive dogma of the German Wehrmacht. The challenge was not just tactical, it was logistical. Could the Canadian and British forces maintain the momentum, the vast engine of supply they had built, while navigating terrain perfectly suited for defense? The Canadian forces, in particular, were facing an almost immediate and desperate counterattack from veteran panzer divisions, including the fanatical 12th SS Hitlerjugend. These young men, hardened by Nazi ideology, fought with a savage intensity that shocked the Allied infantry. For every yard gained, there was a disproportionate cost in blood and steel. The Allied technological superiority, the sheer number of Sherman tanks rolling off the production lines, the dominance of the air provided by the ubiquitous P-47 Thunderbolts and Spitfires, was struggling to overcome the defensive genius of the German command and the lethality of their superior armored vehicles like the Panther and the Tiger. Consider the infantryman, Private William Bill McLean of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada. He was 22, fresh from the training fields of England, and now fully immersed in a landscape that devoured men and sanity. Bill carried the standard infantry rifle, the Lee Enfield No. 4 Mancaiwan, renowned for its 10-round magazine and reliability, but utterly exposed in a confrontation with a German machine gun nest, utilizing the terrifyingly efficient MG-42, the Hitler's buzzsaw. But Bill's war, and the war of millions like him, was not just fought with bullets. It was fought in the relentless pursuit of supply lines, the 10,000 tons of materiel that had to land every single day just to keep the operation afloat. It was a logistical marvel, a temporary city built on the choppy waters of the English Channel. It was the vast, impersonal scale of total war, colliding violently with the intensely personal fear of a single young man crawling through a muddy drainage ditch. It is amidst this colossal military undertaking, this relentless clash of titans, that a quiet, deeply personal drama was already unfolding, miles behind the active front lines. Our story begins not with the roar of a tank, but with the silence of a forced decision. It is the story of Elsa, a woman raised in a small village near Caen, whose life was a contradiction. Her language, her friends, her culture were French, yet her lineage, her extended family, the blood in her veins, was rooted deep in Germany. For years, as the Reich tightened its grip, Elsa had walked a knife's edge. Her German relatives, some of them holding minor positions within the occupation government, had initially tried to claim her. But when she demonstrated an unmistakable loyalty to her French neighbors and quietly resisted the occupying forces, providing food, sharing rumors, she was quickly denounced. The irony was devastating. Her German blood made her an object of suspicion to the French resistance, yet her independent spirit had turned her into an enemy in the eyes of her own kin. She was an outcast by both sides. The arrival of the Allied forces, heralded by the deep, continuous drone of thousands of aircraft, was supposed to be a liberation. For Elsa, it was merely the exchange of one kind of fear for another. The Wehrmacht retreated, not in disorder, but in calculated, ruthless fighting withdrawals, leaving behind a vacuum often filled with mistrust, retribution, and chaos. Elsa found herself caught in the sudden, savage momentum of liberation, where loyalty was measured in absolutes, and her mixed heritage was a glaring, dangerous question mark. The narrative of total war, of technological and strategic genius, is utterly incomplete without the personal element. The question that hangs over this entire drama, the core of our thesis, is this: How does a person navigate a war where their identity itself is considered a liability, where the only thing that can save them is the blind, improbable choice of a man they should, by all accounts, consider an enemy? The stage is set. The mechanical behemoth of the Allied advance is grinding forward, fueled by the logistical genius of figures like Lord Mountbatten and the simple determination of soldiers like Bill McLean. And waiting in the wreckage is a quiet young woman, Elsa, whose very existence is a flashpoint of historical and personal conflict. If the logistics of history, the deep personal stories framed by the largest conflict the world has ever known, intrigue you, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these meticulously researched narratives to life. The first weeks of the Normandy campaign were a masterclass in military paradox. While Allied soldiers fought house to house, enduring the brutal attrition of the hedgerows, the true genius of the invasion was operating on a scale unseen in warfare. This was the era where industrial might became the ultimate weapon. The Allied war machine operated under the strategic umbrella of overwhelming air superiority. The German Luftwaffe had been systematically decimated long before D-Day. Consider the figures. By June 1944, the combined strength of the RAF and USAAF over the invasion area was nearly 13,000 operational aircraft. The Luftwaffe could barely muster 300. This air dominance was not merely tactical. It was a fundamental strategic shift. Every German movement, every supply truck, every gathering of armor was a target for the dreaded fighter bombers. The workhorses of this aerial arsenal were machines like the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a colossal aircraft known affectionately by its pilots as the Jug. It was not sleek or graceful. It was a massive, radial-engined beast, designed not just for dogfighting, but for absorbing punishment and delivering maximum devastation on the ground. Its payload was devastating: 8 50-caliber machine guns, each firing over 750 rounds per minute, plus up to 2,500 pounds of bombs and rockets. It was an aerial battering ram, transforming the open roads of France into killing zones. The Germans were left struggling to counter this technological tsunami. Their primary heavy defense was often the 80mm flak gun, a dual-purpose weapon feared by Allied crews and infantry alike. Its high velocity and heavy shell could pierce the armor of a Sherman tank with terrifying ease. Yet, even the 88s were often overwhelmed by the sheer volume of attacks and the strategic interdiction that starved their ammunition supply. Now, let's pivot back to Private Bill McLean, fighting a war where the average life expectancy of a frontline Canadian infantry replacement was measured in weeks. Bill's experience was one of endless vigilance against the technical superiority of certain German weapons. He knew the sound of a Panther tank. This German medium tank, with its sloping frontal armor, a design inspired by the Soviet T-34, was virtually immune to the standard 75mm gun on the Sherman tank at long range. Allied doctrine countered this not with better individual tanks initially, but with numbers and artillery. The strategic thinking was clear. If a Panther could withstand 4 Sherman shots, throw 5 Shermans at it. If that failed, call in a devastating artillery barrage. Accepted Relic, pilot of the 365th Fighter Group, USAAF. The ground guys, they'd call us mud movers. They didn't see the air war, they just saw the smoke and the wreckage we left behind. But we were their shield. Every time a Kraut tank column tried to form up, we were on it like a hawk on a field mouse. That Jug? It wasn't pretty, but it brought me home, and it burned out a lot of Germans who were aiming for the infantry. Elsa's life intersected with this mechanized behemoth almost accidentally. Her village became a temporary staging ground for Canadian advance units. The men came in exhausted, muddy, and initially wary of the French populace. The village, having just seen the Germans depart, was in a state of nervous energy. The shift from repression to liberation was instantaneous, and the atmosphere was ripe for mistake and accusation. In the chaotic aftermath, Elsa was quickly identified by a local, jealous collaborator, a man desperate to save his own skin, who pointed her out to the Canadian military police, whispering the accusation, Deutsch Blut, German family, a spy. This was the central danger of her existence. In the frenzied atmosphere of liberation, due process was often sacrificed for immediate, emotional justice. Rumors were fatal. And here, her German heritage, once a source of her rejection by the French resistance, became the pretext for her potential arrest. It was into this volatile scene that Corporal Bill McLean arrived. He was a signaller, not an arresting officer. His job was the maintenance of communication, the lifeblood of the Canadian advance, relying on the sophisticated, but often temperamental, No. 19 wireless set, a complex radio system that connected tanks and infantry. Bill saw not a spy, but a person paralyzed by fear and injustice, standing before an angry, emotional crowd. He heard the accusations, but he also saw the look in her eyes, the look of utter, isolated desperation. The system, the strategy, the industrial scale of war had momentarily paused for him, replaced by a simple, human calculation. He had to make a choice that would defy the prevailing sentiment of suspicion and hate. The strategic movement of an entire army, the logistical miracle of the Mulberry Harbors, the technical sophistication of the P-47, all led to this single, quiet, human intersection. A terrified, mixed-heritage woman and a young Canadian soldier, about to put his reputation, and perhaps his life, on the line for a complete stranger. The red thread of their destiny was about to be pulled taut. The arrest was inevitable, given the prevailing atmosphere. The collaborating informer, desperate to prove his own loyalty, was loud and convincing. For the Canadian military police, under immense pressure to secure lines of communication and eliminate potential threats, the word German was enough to warrant immediate detention. Bill McLean, still focused on coordinating the radio net, saw the scene explode. He saw the shift in the crowd's eyes, the righteous anger of the newly liberated, seeking an easy target for the accumulated years of rage. He knew the procedural path. Elsa would be taken to a temporary detention center, interrogated, and likely held until the chaos subsided. But he also knew the reality of wartime justice in the field, a process often swift, brutal, and tragically final. His immediate, irrational response was an act of pure defiance against the impersonal logic of war. He stepped forward. "She's with me," he said, his voice surprisingly firm, cutting through the accusatory noise. The military police sergeant, a man hardened by years of discipline, looked at the young corporal in disbelief. "What was that, McLean?" "This woman is suspected of aiding the enemy. We have an eyewitness." Bill knew he couldn't lie about his connection to her because there was none. He had to appeal to a higher, equally urgent wartime necessity, the need for effective communication and intelligence. "Sir, she assisted me yesterday, navigating the sector. Her knowledge of the village layout and the terrain around the D-158 road was vital for laying our primary communications cable. She is currently assigned to me as a local intelligence asset, provisional." It was a brilliant, almost desperate piece of theater. The word intelligence was sacred. It instantly transformed Elsa from a potential spy to a valued, if unauthorized, asset. The sergeant hesitated. To question the use of a local asset, regardless of background, was to question the military necessity of rapid advance. This pivot in the narrative highlights a core element of the Allied strategy, the absolute reliance on rapid intelligence gathering. From the ultra-intercepts at Bletchley Park, a technological marvel of code breaking, to the simple, human intelligence gleaned from locals in occupied villages, information was power. Bill was exploiting the very technological and strategic need for information to save a life. Elsa, standing silent, understood immediately. Her life was now tied to a soldier she had never met, on a pretext that was entirely false but strategically necessary. She played her part, saying nothing, simply nodding in acknowledgement of the assignment. The crowd, seeing the military police relent to the needs of the front, dispersed, their anger diffused by bureaucratic authority. Bill and Elsa were left alone. Elsa's perspective, fictionalized based on relics. "He saved me not with a gun, but with a word. Intelligence. A simple, technical lie." I looked at him, a Canadian, the uniform of the enemy that wasn't the enemy, and knew my life was no longer my own. It belonged to the lie we had just created together. The immediate threat was over, but the strategic entanglement had just begun. Bill now had a fundamental security risk on his hands. He could not turn her over, not now. The military police would follow up on his report, and the lie would be exposed, potentially leading to charges of obstructing an investigation, a serious offense in a combat zone. His only option was to make the lie true, or at least maintain the appearance of truth. He needed to integrate her into his small signaler unit, a group of men focused on the intricate mechanics of communication. This required a level of trust that was entirely contrary to standard operating procedure. He had to convince his colleagues that Elsa, the woman with German blood, was indispensable. He took her to the heart of his work, a small field tent housing their number 19 set. He began by showing her the sheer technical complexity of their operation. "This," he explained, pointing to the cumbersome radio unit, "is the air we breathe. We send data, reports on German armor movement, requests for artillery fire, changes in position. It has to be accurate. We need to know the exact location of the Jagdpanzer IV emplacements reported near the N13 highway." He challenged her to prove his lie, to use her local knowledge, her fluency in both languages, her intimate knowledge of the area's geography, to actually become the intelligence asset he claimed she was. This was the pivotal moment of strategic conversion. Elsa's personal conflict, her identity, was now repurposed for the Allied cause. Her rejection by her German kin, her fluency in the enemy's language, her detailed, lifelong knowledge of the territory, were suddenly transformed from liabilities into tactical advantages. The technological needs of the advance created a desperate space for human connection, a red thread woven through the massive, impersonal tapestry of the war effort. Bill's decision placed him and his unit, two other signalers, Private Jensen and Sergeant Davies, in an extraordinary position. They were now operating with an unauthorized, locally sourced intelligence asset whose background was, at best, compromised. The safety of their entire operation, the integrity of their communications net, was on the line. The technological landscape of their work was fraught with danger. Communication was a life-or-death service, but it was also a target. German intelligence, though battered, was actively hunting Allied radio transmissions. The Allies relied on complex radio protocols and systems like the SCR-300 walkie-talkie for short-range infantry command and the aforementioned number 19 set for armored and divisional communications. The German counter was the use of specialized radio interception units designed to triangulate the source of a signal and call in immediate artillery fire. For Elsa, the world of the signalers was a maze of technical jargon, coded maps, and the constant, unnerving hiss of the radio. Bill began her training not by teaching her coding, but by showing her how to interpret the landscape through a tactical lens. Where is the nearest cellar or quarry big enough to hide a Stug 3 assault gun? Not where you think it is, but where a commander who knows we have air superiority would hide it, Bill instructed her, laying out detailed ordnance survey maps captured during the landing. Elsa, initially hesitant, soon realized this wasn't merely a performance. Bill was genuinely relying on her, incorporating her local knowledge into his tactical reports. She began identifying forgotten side roads, the precise angles of hedgerows that could conceal a machine gun nest, and the best vantage points for artillery spotting, details that no Allied aerial reconnaissance could provide with the same certainty. Sergeant Davies, Canadian Signals Corps. McLean brought her in, and we were all skeptical. German blood? Are you crazy? But she showed us. We were trying to find a clear line of sight for a new antenna array, needed to relay critical data on a counterattack. We spent 6 hours looking. She pointed to a chimney of a burned-out farmhouse, said the elevation was perfect, and the ruins would mask the antennae from air view. Saved us a day of work. You can't argue with results in a war zone. Elsa's most critical value came when the German forces used captured or poorly maintained Allied equipment. On one tense night, Bill's unit picked up a faint radio transmission. It was a fragment of code, but the voice speaking was in clear German. Elsa listened intently. "It is not a Wehrmacht accent," she whispered to Bill. "It is the accent of the SS. The way they pronounce Panzer is different, more clipped. They are using an unauthorized close-range set, likely a patrol of the 12th SS, cut off from their command. This detail, the slight nuance of an accent, was beyond the technical capability of the radio equipment. It was a purely human intelligence intercept. The information, the isolated SS patrol, was immediately relayed to the forward observation post, resulting in the successful preemption of an ambush that morning. Her ability to discern the enemy by the sound of their voice, the very language that had made her a pariah, had now saved Canadian lives. The tension within the unit began to ease, replaced by a deep, professional respect. Yet, the secrecy had to be maintained. They were operating outside the legal framework, and any official audit would expose their deception. The risk was compounded by the fact that the advance was relentless. Every time they moved their position, the lie had to be rebuilt from scratch, the deception maintained for a new set of officers, a new sector. The emotional toll on Bill was immense. He was living a dual life, a soldier performing his duty with technical precision, and a protector, guarding a woman he was rapidly beginning to admire. He had made a simple moral choice, and the strategic complexities of the war now demanded he maintain the facade or face court-martial. The relationship between Bill and Elsa was born of necessity, forged in the crucible of tactical risk. They were two people, utterly alone in their predicament. Bill, alone in his secret, and Elsa, alone in her identity, who found an unexpected refuge in the detailed technical work of the Signal Corps. The constant nervous energy of the radio room, the silent communication between them as they tracked enemy movements, was the new language of their bonding. They were a technical asset and a tactical operator, bound together by the red thread of a desperate life-saving lie. The Allied advance, though strategically sound, was punctuated by moments of terrifying vulnerability. The German strategy, particularly after the devastating Allied bombing of St. Lo, shifted to a brilliant, desperate defense, exploiting the sheer overstretch of the Allied supply lines and the predictability of their communications. Bill's unit was stationed in an exposed sector near the Falaise Pocket, responsible for maintaining a relay link crucial for directing the advance of the Canadian Force Corps. They were utilizing a new, more powerful antenna, a directional Yagi array, designed to penetrate the enemy's jamming attempts, but also requiring a highly exposed position. This reliance on sophisticated technology contained an inherent risk. The German engineers had anticipated the Allied reliance on high-frequency, reliable communication. Their response was the use of captured Allied radios, and even their own FUG-10 sets repurposed for a tactic known as spoofing. They would mimic Allied communication patterns, down to the use of fake call signs and slightly incorrect procedural terminology, to lure Allied units into traps, or more commonly, to force them to reveal their location by replying to the false transmission. On a cold, foggy morning, the unit picked up a transmission, a distress call. The voice, speaking fluent English, claimed to be a forward observation post, pinned down and desperately needing artillery coordinates to counter a rapid panzer assault. The message was perfectly formatted, using the correct encryption sequence for a temporary forward post. The signalers were immediately ready to relay the coordinates, but Elsa, listening intently, felt a jolt of historical irony. "Wait," she told Bill, her hand resting on the transmit key. "The code is correct, but listen to the cadence. The man says immediate fire with a pause. A Canadian under direct fire would not pause like that. He is too calm. And listen to the word for the coordinate grid reference. He says zebra with a slight roll on the R sound. That is not a Canadian pronunciation. It is an educated, perhaps Berlin-trained German trying to sound English." It was a piece of human phonetics that bypassed all the technological safeguards. The enemy had perfectly replicated the code and the technology, but failed on the most basic human element, the unconscious accent. Bill, trusting her completely now, aborted the transmission. They had been seconds away from revealing their position and the true location of the Canadian Marine Corps Command by responding to the spoof. The realization was immediate and terrifying. The German command was not only intercepting, but actively using the Allied communications against them. The strategic advantage of speed and coordination was being compromised. Bill made a decision that violated protocol but saved their lives. He ordered the Yagi antenna to be dismantled and switched the entire unit back to the lower frequency, short-range, and less powerful standard whip antenna, dramatically reducing their transmission range but making them almost impossible to triangulate. Bill McLean's report, reconstructed. We abandoned the high-gain setup. Our effective range dropped by 60%, but our security increased by 100%. The enemy is using voice analysis to lure responses. We can rely on no signal we cannot verify by visual confirmation or by the acute listening skills of our local asset. The consequences of this near failure were profound. Had Bill ignored Elsa, they would have either called artillery fire on friendly forces or been hit by a counter-barrage. The technical superiority of the Allies was only as good as the human judgment applying it. Elsa, however, was shaken. The near miss brought her German origins into the sharpest possible focus. She was using the language of her kin, the cultural nuances she had absorbed, to thwart them. The moral weight of her service was immense. She was fighting a war against the blood that had rejected her. The incident secured her position within Bill's unit beyond any doubt, but it also placed a heavier psychological burden on both of them. Their relationship, which had begun as a lie of necessity, was now cemented by a shared moment of professional terror and triumph. They were now co-conspirators in both an operational and an emotional sense. The war of technology and strategy had been won in that moment by a simple human ear. The war effort ground into its final brutal phase in France, the race toward Paris and the closing of the Falaise Gap. This phase demanded ultimate endurance, both for the mechanized armies and the individuals caught in their path. Elsa and Bill's entanglement reached its climax during a major push through a village called Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives. This was where the remaining German forces, desperate and cornered, were making a final, ferocious stand. The Canadian forces were facing a desperate German counterattack aimed at keeping the escape route open for the encircled 7th Army. Bill's unit, tasked with maintaining forward command contact, found themselves cut off in the chaos. The German forces, predominantly remnants of the Wehrmacht and some SS divisions, were using improvised and highly effective tactics, snipers and close-quarters Panzerfaust teams. In the confusion, Bill's small unit was cornered in the basement of a ruined church. Sergeant Davies was wounded, and the number 19 set was damaged. A key crystal oscillator, critical for frequency stability, was shattered. They were deaf and blind, trapped behind enemy lines, with an injured man. Elsa, the former outcast, became the tactical commander. She knew the ancient tunnel system beneath the church, a remnant of the village's history. She led Bill and Jensen through the dark, subterranean passages, a move that bypassed a significant German roadblock. But the final escape required a crucial piece of technology, a functioning radio. Bill pulled out his emergency walkie-talkie SCR-300, the smaller, infantry-level set. It had limited range, but it was functional. The problem was range and direction. They were too deep within the German pocket, and their transmission would be immediately localized. Elsa proposed a daring, terrifying solution. She would use her language to give the Germans a false target, buying Bill the critical minutes he needed to transmit their actual location. The plan was a high-stakes gamble. Bill would climb the church spire and transmit a 4-digit grid reference, their actual location, to a known Canadian frequency. Simultaneously, Elsa would take the spare German Torn. Fu, B1 radio they had captured days earlier, climbed the opposite hill and transmit a completely different, false, urgent message in flawless German, using the SS accent she had learned to identify. Elsa to Bill. You have 4 minutes from the moment I begin speaking. They will triangulate the strongest German voice first. I will be the decoy. They will shoot at the German, not the Canadian. It was a final, complete act of severing her ties to her heritage, weaponizing her German blood for the Canadian cause. The irony was devastatingly complete. She was fulfilling the role of the enemy for the family that had first labeled her as such. The scene was a cacophony of fear and technical precision. Elsa, alone on a ruined hill, began her transmission. An urgent, seemingly panicky request for panzer support at a grid location miles from their true position. Bill, high in the spire, heard her voice, her carefully controlled fear, the perfect, clipped German, and knew the clock was ticking. The sound of distant artillery, instantly redirected towards her false position, followed almost immediately. Bill transmitted his coordinates. His message was received. The Canadian artillery responded, not targeting Elsa's fake position, but laying down a precise, massive, suppressive barrage between their position and the approaching German patrol. Elsa, narrowly escaping the blast intended for her decoy position, met Bill in the rendezvous point. They had survived, not through military might alone, but through the precise application of human intelligence, linguistics, in conjunction with Allied technological and artillery superiority. The battle for Saint-Lambert was a turning point. For Bill and Elsa, it was the final, defining moment where the necessity of their alliance transformed into an inseparable bond. The Falaise Gap closed, trapping the bulk of the German forces in the west and effectively ending the Battle of Normandy. The massive strategic and logistical effort paid off, opening the route to Paris. For Bill and Elsa, the victory was personal. The immediate danger was past, but the military bureaucracy remained. Now that the front line was stabilized, the command structure began its inevitable process of cleanup and audit. Bill's unit was required to submit a comprehensive report detailing their unauthorized use of a local asset and her near-fatal decoy maneuver. Bill knew the truth would not survive an official review. He could not openly confess the lie he had built, nor could he allow Elsa to be processed as a former intelligence asset, which would subject her to endless scrutiny and potential deportation by the French authorities, who were still seeking vengeance against anyone with even a tangential connection to the enemy. His solution was another act of strategic subversion, but this time it was an act of pure love, transcending military law and national borders. He used the official channels to his advantage. He created a formal, high-level request for an immediate expedited special services discharge. His reasoning was based on the technical skills he had developed on the front lines and an alleged pre-war commitment to return to Canada to assist in the critical development of civilian radio infrastructure. It was a plausible, if unusual, request. Simultaneously, he convinced a sympathetic regimental chaplain, a man who knew their story, to notarize an affidavit of intent to marry, a document that, by Canadian wartime regulation, granted a degree of protected status to a foreign fiancé. The documentation was confusing, strategically timed, and bureaucratic enough to be accepted. The sheer volume of paperwork generated by the closing of the war meant that an unusual discharge request could slip through the cracks. The war of logistics, the massive scale of the conflict, provided the perfect cover for their small personal escape. Bill McLean received his discharge in late 1944. He departed Europe not with a tank or a radio set, but with Elsa, his wife-to-be, on a military transport heading back to Canada. The legacy of their story is a powerful counterpoint to the grand, impersonal narrative of the war. Technological legacy, the technical details, the know. 19 set, the P-47, the MG-42 are the hardware of history. But the software, the human element that controlled them, was ultimately what mattered. Elsa's story proves that the most sophisticated weapon was the human mind, capable of linguistic nuance and moral courage. Strategic legacy. Their experience illustrates the massive strategic cost of relying on absolute technological solutions. The German failure to account for human variables, like an accent, was the Achilles heel that an isolated Canadian corporal and a German-blooded Frenchwoman exploited. Bill McLean returned to Canada and did, in fact, use his Signal Corps experience. He did not build massive radio infrastructure, but he became a respected technician for a local telephone company. Elsa McLean became an English teacher, teaching the language that had, ironically, saved her life. They never spoke publicly about the technical lie that began their relationship, allowing the red thread of their true love to overshadow the brutal mechanics of their escape. Their story is not about the end of the war, but about the beginning of a life, a quiet act of human defiance against the machinery of global conflict. It demonstrates that in a war defined by industry, technology, and overwhelming numbers, the most profound victories were often those won by a simple, courageous choice. The colossal scale of World War II, its technical brilliance, its strategic genius, its industrial might, was ultimately just a backdrop. The true story of history is always found in the small, improbable choices made by individuals like Bill and Elsa, bound together by the red thread of fate. The post-war world quickly sought to catalog and file away the overwhelming experience of the conflict. The machines were mothballed, the strategies dissected in staff colleges, and the human cost tallied in solemn memorials. But the subtle personal dramas, the red threads woven through the tapestry of war, endured long after the last shell was fired. Bill and Elsa McLean settled into a quiet life in British Columbia. Their home was a place of deep, almost unnerving quiet, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the Signal Corps and the constant, nervous chatter of the number 19 set. They raised 3 children, none of whom fully grasped the profound historical irony of their parents' union. Elsa, now Mrs. McLean, carried the deepest scar, the memory of her kin's rejection, compounded by the necessary betrayal of her language and lineage for survival. She was the ghost of a German past and the reality of a Canadian future. This inner conflict highlights a psychological aspect of war often overlooked in technical narratives, the destruction of self-identity. She found peace not by forgetting, but by channeling her linguistic ability into her teaching, guiding others to master the words that had once been her greatest danger, and ultimately, her salvation. Bill, the quiet Canadian corporal, never discussed his technical deception. His heroism was not in a medal, but in his choice, the split-second decision to sacrifice his military security for the sake of human justice. His post-war career as a technician was a quiet continuation of his wartime role, fixing what was broken, ensuring clear communication, and maintaining the unseen infrastructure that held life together. The statistics of the war are vast. 60 million dead, 6 million vehicles produced, 3 million combat aircraft. But within that overwhelming scale, the McLean story remains a potent reminder. It took the logistical marvel of the Allied armies to put Bill on that road in Normandy. It took the strategic bombing campaign to create the environment of chaos where Elsa's secret was exposed. It took the technical sophistication of the German radio-torn Fu B-1 to provide the decoy. But it took only one moment of human compassion, a single deviation from the tactical playbook, to write the ending. The irony is the ultimate lesson. The technical and military systems of both sides were designed to create absolute separation, us versus them, Canadian versus German, friend versus enemy. Yet, the final, most defining act of their story was an act of unity, achieved by exploiting the very systems designed to divide them. The vast machinery of total war could not account for, nor could it extinguish, the simple, powerful pull of human connection. The war ended for the world in 1945, but for Bill and Elsa, their private war ended the day they stepped off that boat in Halifax. 2 people united by a lie that became a truth, a German accent that became a savior, and a red thread of fate woven through the bloodiest conflict in human history. They proved that even at the pinnacle of technological and strategic warfare, the smallest, most personal human choice can create the most enduring and beautiful legacy. If the deep personal stories framed by the great technological and strategic conflicts of history resonate with you, please ensure you subscribe to our channel. It is your support that allows us to continue unearthing these vital human narratives that define the ultimate cost and triumph of war.